Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally here. It is finally time for the start of the NACL 2025 season. Spring is already here. I know it feels like it's been forever with all the other leagues that we cover starting up in winter, but we finally get a taste of some Tier 2 action here in North America with week number 1. This is, of course, my overview and analysis video for week number 1, and I couldn't be more excited to get into it. If you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from the games this week, and did the teams or the players live up to the hype that maybe you had for them at the beginning of the split? Were there any surprises? Were there any shocks? Of course, I'll go over, where I was surprised, where maybe I feel pretty good about some of my predictions. And speaking of those predictions, if you haven't checked out my primer video for the NACL in the spring split so far, you can check that out up in the iCard. That's going to be me power ranking every single one of these teams from number 10 to number 1, talking about every player, ranking them within their position, all of that good stuff. I definitely recommend you check that out before watching this, but it's not necessary. We will be going over everything you need to know in today's video. So without further ado, let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover. And at the end of the video, we will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, be updating my power rankings at the end of this video in standings format in that same way. So stick around to see which teams I think are better than maybe I was anticipating, or which teams are maybe a little bit worse than we were anticipating. But most of today will be spent talking about the best of threes that we got in week number 1. So without further ado, let's get into the actual analysis. We finally get to jump into talking about some tier 2 games, and it's two teams that qualified out of the open qualifiers that are going to be kicking us off here in 2025. It's Conviction taking on Apex Mission Impossible, and as predicted, Conviction is going to be able to pick up the win. Just if you're new to the format, if you're new to the NACL, I never really kind of explain what you see up on the screen here, but I figure with the new year, we could go over a bit of, what's on the screen. Of course, every single team is going to be listed, or the two teams that are playing are going to be listed here. You can see the games and their stat lines on the bottom side of the top part of this image, if that makes any sense. So Conviction won game 1 in 44 minutes and 23 seconds by a kill score of 20-21. It was a rather close game, and you can see the same thing for game number 2. We have all 10 players listed near the bottom. Highlighted in green is going to be my player of the series. Highlighted in red is going to be my dud of the series. And then, of course, the drafts on each side. The numbers next to the team names, so 6 for Conviction and 9 for AMI, is just where I personally had these teams power ranked at the beginning of the week. And so, we'll kind of see which teams end up living up to that. But at least for now, Conviction kind of making the most of their first opportunity here. Of course, this is formerly Tempest Gaming coming out of the OQs. They end up merging with Conviction so that they actually have some salaries to go and play in the NACL. But the roster is unchanged. You might notice that it says Chrome instead of Aaron. It does look like he's going by Chrome now, at the very least in terms of his in-game actual name for all of these tournaments. I will be calling him Chrome. If he actually is going by Aaron and this is all some elaborate prank, then just let me know down in the comment section below. But at least for now, I'm going to assume that this is a name change over to Chrome, and I will be referring to him as such. Outside of that, everything else was anticipated, and even the Conviction win was anticipated. I love the drafts for both of these teams. I do think that it gives both of them quite a few options. I'm a big fan of things like Ivor and Tristana. Right now, we're going to see more of Tristana in particular later on this week. Nefiri has really been popping off over in the LPL. We've talked about that a ton on this channel, but when you're looking at what ended up taking over this series, player of the series was rather simple for me. It is going to go to Hoarder in the top lane, his first ever game at the tier 2 level, or I guess his first ever series at the tier 2 level, and he absolutely dominates. That Olaf in particular in game number 2 was absolutely unstoppable. It was his game to run. And let me tell you, he absolutely ran it. It really was awesome to watch. Decoy was really not able to keep up at any point in game number 2. And I'm really just impressed with Hoarder. I was really impressed with him in the open qualifiers. I thought his laning was a lot better than I was anticipating it to be. Not because I think he's a bad player, but because he was going up against some really good players. I think that series against Citadel, in particular against Philip, really impressed me, where he basically completely gapped him in game number 3 and was a big reason why this team ended up qualifying for the NACL in the first place. That has very much carried over here to week number 1, where he's already started off super strong. But if you wanted to give player of the series to Chrome for that Jhin game in game number 1, I also think that that's kind of your prerogative. It's basically 2 carries for each game. You had Chrome in game 1 and Hoarder in game number 2, whichever one you thought was more important, I think is kind of up to you for player of the series. I'm giving it to Hoarder because I was just more impressed by his Rumble game than I was by Chrome's Callista game. Honestly, the bot lane in game number 2 wasn't all that fantastic for Conviction. They were, I would say, the weak link of game number 2, if you can even really say that, because they won pretty handily. But this was a closer series than I was anticipating, and I think a lot of that goes in favor of AMI, of Apex Mission Impossible, who we just had gigantically low expectations for going into the year. Nobody really thought this team was going to be able to do anything. I had them at number 9 in my power rankings only because I think Polestar projects to be even worse, but AMI, in a normal split of the NACL would pretty clearly be the worst team in the league, but they put up a pretty good fight here, and honestly, there are some things I was impressed by. I think most notably, Baz was pretty good in this series, and Baz is a player that I really did not have a lot of confidence in going into this split. I talked about players like Mini, players like Pocus, players like Decoy that I expected to be decently relevant, but Lojaz and Baz I think were players that I really needed to see actually perform at the tier 2 level. I don't think either of them were the problem here. Decoy definitely got beat in game number 2, but he had an okay game number 1 on the Aurora, all things considered, and so I'm not really going to yell at him too much. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Pocus in the support position, not even really because he played all that bad, but mostly because as the support, you are kind of the one that's just going to be giving over the most amount of resources to the other side. The only other player that I really even kind of considered for this was Mini in the mid lane. You can see his score line's pretty good, but that's not necessarily reflective of, I think, how he played. He was super important in game number 1 on the Mbessa. He was one of, if not the most important member of AMI to keeping them in that game and keeping things at least a little bit close, but he was completely useless on the Yone in game number 2. He was clearly the worst player in the game in game number 2. Having that balance out, that's not a dud of the series for me. That unfortunately does fall to Pocus because he was this engaged support that ended up going in and being the first to die in basically every fight. Even if that is kind of his job, it's just difficult to evaluate that in a positive way. Again, I think you could give this to Decoy for that game number 2 on the Gragas, but I don't think Decoy individually played awful. I think Hoarder was just really good. Lojaz did not have the same kind of pressure that Kizno had on the other side. Again, same thing for Baz. Even if Baz was kind of important, and I do think the bot lane was generally fine, especially in the 2v2, and especially in game number 2 when they had the Tristana, it still just wasn't quite enough. And I think, unfortunately, this is probably best case scenario for AMI, is that they're super competitive against a team that is decently good. They're able to take advantage of weaknesses with players like Manui stepping up a little bit too far, players like Kizno being a little bit too aggressive. Like, they're able to take advantage of that, but they don't really have the firepower to be able to close out games. That's the frustrating part for this team. I think there were a lot of building blocks, though, and at the end of the day, it is just Series 1 in week number 1. There still is a lot to grow and a lot to learn from as we move forward, but this is a really nice win for Conviction. You expect them to be at the very least a mid-table team, or, at best an upper mid-table team. I don't think they're all that far away from being like the 4th best team in the NACL. I think that that's pretty up for grabs, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go on throughout this video, but at least for now, Hoarder and Chrome in particular looking really good is really encouraging. If Kizno and Darkwings can just continue to stay solid and consistent in the middle of the map, and if Manui can continue to grow, I think that's going to be really nice for Conviction, and I think we could potentially be looking at a team that could surprise a lot of people this year. But then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and this was probably the matchup of the week, not only in terms of expectations, but in terms of what actually happened on the Rift. It was Near Airport making their NACL debut against Luminosity Gaming, who is also kind of making their NACL debut. And Luminosity is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. It was incredibly close. NA did a great job to be able to start out strong in this series off the back of Spica's Neferi, off the back of Double Lift's Jin, which all looked incredibly good. Biofrost looked excellent on the Rakan, but they couldn't keep the pressure up. Once they moved into game 2, they got a little cocky, they got a little greedy in terms of the draft, going for Nidalee and Vayne. Top lane for TF Blade that ends up getting punished pretty hard, and then in game 3, they just don't have the firepower to be able to enable Spica in the way that they were able to do against worse competition in the OQs, at least as effortlessly as they did. You had 2 players that I think were absolutely excellent on the side of Luminosity, and that's enough to be able to get them over the top here. I think a lot of people were, very interested to see where NA ended up landing. I think we have a pretty good idea now, and I think I feel even better about putting them at number 3 in my power rankings, but I feel even better about putting Luminosity at number 2 in my power rankings, because this team is absurdly good. Like, they are very, very strong at being able to play late game team fights, and they're just super consistent throughout, what kind of style they want to play. The Cho'Gath mid in game number 3 with the Warwick top. Obviously it's not the most conventional draft, but it's very Luminosity. This is a very Insanity-esque mid lane pick. It's a very Fake God-esque top lane pick, even something like the Taric in the support position for Zeyzal. It all comes together to really show that Luminosity's style and the expectation for what their playstyle will be throughout the rest of the split was pretty spot on from what a lot of people thought in the preseason. Player of the series was honestly kind of tough though, if only because there were 2 players that absolutely dominated or looked incredibly good, were really important towards the success, and they were Fake God and Tactical. I think you could basically give it to either. I'm giving it to Fake God, which I don't think is going to be a particularly popular opinion to have, because Tactical really did pop off when they needed him the most in game number 3. They don't win game 3 without the Tristana being as fed as she is and without Tactical just being better than Doublelift on the other side, because quite frankly he was. But if you're looking at the series as a whole and you're taking games 1 and 2 into account, it's really difficult for me to say that Fake God wasn't the most important player for Luminosity in this series, and maybe I'm a bit top lane biased in that regard. Usually I'm not on this channel. Usually it's actually kind of the opposite, is that I criticize top laners a little bit too much and I don't praise them when they do good things enough. But I was just so impressed with Fake God across this entire series, specifically in game 2 on the Jace. I get that the Vayne is a really greedy pick, but TF Blade's very talented and obviously can generate leads on his own. For Fake God to get so far ahead and get so strong on the Jace and become such a problem, I think is really in his favor. And then the Warwick in game 3 was still really important as setup for everything else that was going on. You do have a lot of lockdown, but you don't really have a secondary damage carry on this team outside of the Tristana. The Warwick helped keep the backline honest from NA and allowed the Tristana to be able to take over more. But again, if you wanted to give player of the series to Tactical, I'm certainly not going to argue. I had Tactical as my number 1 AD carry heading into the NACL split here, and you know what? It's turned out pretty well, at least in this first series. He just was better than Doublelift when it mattered the most down the stretch, and we'll talk about Doublelift once we get over to the NA side, because I think the questions about his champion pool just being a little bit more limited than it was a couple of years ago have very much become, like, they've been brought to the forefront. I'll just say that. Like, they were not dispelled at all by the performance he put out here, but Tactical was just excellent on the Tristana. This is probably the best game that he's played in quite a while, but I think people just forgot how good he was because he's been on bad teams. This has not been a player that's looked outclassed at the tier 1 level recently. He has dragged Immortals kicking and screaming across the finish line at times over the last 2 years, and I'm honestly not surprised to see him come out and step up when it matters the most. He's always been a pretty clutch player going back to his time on Team Liquid. He just hasn't had a chance to show that off recently because he's been on bad teams, and so I expect this to continue. I think Zeyzal looked really good in this series, especially on the Taric in game number 3. That champion can just do so much when set up into a good spot. Tomio and Insanity were also fine. Insanity in particular obviously kind of popping off on the Cho'Gath. I do think that there were moments where he was just too far forward in the other games, especially on the Rise in game number 1, where I don't think he was particularly good. And Tomio was really good as setup, but it doesn't look like he's going to be a big main character for this team. Either way, if you've got enough damage coming out from top and bot, that's totally fine. Tomio can play his comfort zone of Maokai, Sejuani, Skarner, like all of these champions that are really good at being able to enable the rest of the team to take over the game. That's what Tomio was so good at when he was dominating tier 2 before. And again, it just feels like Luminosity has a very good identity, and I'm really excited to see if they can carry that through. Then for Near Airport on the other side, I honestly think this is a perfectly fine first series for them to have. I know that the expectations were kind of out of control and that they were, guaranteed to be a top 3 team, but this was a top 3 team type of performance against one of the best teams in the entire league. Luminosity might be the best team in the entire league, and you did put up a really good fight. You can look at players like Spica and Pobelter, who were super consistent throughout the entire series. Spica as a primary carry option on things like Nefiri and Kindred. It's clear that they want him to be like the guy, that they want him to carry out of the jungle position, and that's going to be their strategy. That's what he did in the OQs, albeit, with less resources poured into him, mostly because he didn't need it. He was dominating 1v1 either way. He's not going to be able to get away with that as much, at least against the top tier talent in the NACL, but he still is good enough to really kind of dominate at this level, and that's what he did here. And Pobelter is exactly who he needs to be, playing things like Talia and Victor and enabling Spica, being fine in lane, and then doing a really good job in team fights. Like, those were the players that I think we got what we expected. Same thing for Biofrost. Again, basically everything we expected out of him. It was TF Blade and Doublelift that did kind of concern me, and if you go back to my primer, the thing I said was the only thing keeping NA out of being the number 1 or number 2 team in my power rankings in this specific league is I just don't know if TF Blade's going to be able to go up against the best top laners in the league, and unfortunately, he wasn't in this series. The Renekton was not good enough in game 3. The Vayne was super greedy in game number 2 and got punished really hard. Like, he's done of the series. He just wasn't good enough for NA on the other side, and he's going to have to be better, and he's certainly going to have to be more consistent in the 1v1 if that's going to be the case. What I was really concerned about is that he basically always won in the OQs, which meant that I didn't really know what he was going to do when he had to play from a neutral situation. It didn't look particularly good here. That's something that just has to get better from him. I think it will. I think he's talented enough to be able to get there, but at least for now, like, if he doesn't dominate lane, what happens to TF Blade? At least in this series, it was nothing good. And then Doublelift just kind of wasn't good at all in game 3. In fact, I would argue that Doublelift was the worst player on NA in game number 3. And that's a really bad sign. Again, the narrative for me going into this entire split was, okay, Doublelift basically only played Jhin and Ashe in the open qualifiers. He did not want to go to anything else. He just wanted to be utility AD carry, wanted to not have resources down in the bot lane. And then, now we're in full Fearless. You can only play those two champions in the first 2 games. And if we go to a game 3 like we did here, what else do you got? And his misfortune was bad. Like, there's nothing else to say. There are a lot of people on Reddit that talk about how bad MF is as a champion. If you follow my other content, you know my opinions and thoughts on that. MF is doing really well statistically in basically every region. We'll see some games later on in the week that kind of prove that MF actually is really strong. He just played it really poor, ended up losing the 2v2 and not being in a great spot, and that just really opened the door for Tactical to be able to take over the game. Doublelift is as big of a part of why this team lost this series as anybody else, so a lot needs to be fixed for NA, but at the end of the day, this is still their first series in the NACL. I'm not expecting perfection from this team, but I know they're expecting to be the #1 team, and at least for now, they're a little bit outside that bubble, but Luminosity might be the #1 team in the NACL. We obviously haven't seen DarkZero yet. We'll talk about them a bit more later on in the video, but Luminosity is terrifying, and if Tactical is still going to be a #1 option, if Fake God is going to continue to be the best top laner in Tier 2, even if he can't quite dominate Tier 1, this is going to be a very difficult team to break down because they just don't really have a lot of weaknesses, and that was really shown off here. But then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with a pretty obvious matchup on paper. It was DarkZero taking on Pulse. And DarkZero, of course, is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 win, but honestly, at least these games were kind of interesting. They were kind of fun. They had some interesting storylines. Like, we expected Pulse to get absolutely obliterated in this one. This is the best team in my power rankings taking on the worst team in my power rankings, but at the end of the day, at least Pulse was interesting in game number 1 until, of course, Zamudo ended up taking over. But really, that is the entire conversation surrounding this series, is just, wow, Zamudo's pretty good, huh? This guy's got some crazy mechanics, huh? I was a little bit worried that Zamudo wasn't going to be able to follow up his breakout 2024 with as good of a 2025. It was just very difficult for me to imagine a year where he was going to be better than he was last year, because everything kind of went right for him last year. It was a bot lane focused team that really could spend a lot of time, getting him in 1v1s and getting him in situations where he could just use his mechanics to win. UG is obviously one of, if not the best player in the entire league at the current moment. Him and Spica were 1A, 1B in terms of my rankings coming into this year, and Spyrex is a mid laner who loves to give resources to the top side of the map. It felt like a perfect storm last year for Zamudo to be kind of the primary option, and while a lot of those pieces are still here, I think the loss of Scary Jerry and Sajed coming in potentially being more of a weak side bot laner doesn't help his case, if that makes sense. I think playing for him more might even just draw more attention to him, all of that, yada, yada, yada. Well, I was wrong. It's not accurate. This guy absolutely obliterated this first series. 18-0 and 15 on the Gwen and the Scion. The Gwen game in particular in game number 1 was unstoppable. Oh, by the way, he's player of the series. I don't think you need me to tell you that. There was no debate over this. I mean, UG was excellent. I really want to point out just how good UG was in the jungle, but there was no debate. Zamudo was the best player on the Rift. The Gwen was unstoppable in game number 1. He actively, he could have 1v9. He didn't have to because the rest of the team was in a good spot, or at least an okay enough spot, but he wins one fight around Dragon and the game is over. Pulse is in an okay position for the beginning part of that game and just completely throws it away by allowing Zamudo to take over on the Gwen. But it's not even just the Gwen, it's the Scion game in game number 2 as well that really makes it okay, you can't stop this guy. They end up playing strong side Scion, and boy does he take over the game. He's unkillable, unstoppable, ends up getting a couple of solo kills throughout this game on players like Adam as they jump in a little bit over aggressive. It's just ridiculous how good Zamudo was, and I get that this is a lower level of competition, that Pulse is pretty clearly the worst team in the NACL at the current moment, but still, to see Zamudo pop off in the way that he did is super impressive. I do want to give a big shout out to UG, who continues to be incredible. There's just nothing else to say. He should not be in tier 2. He should be a tier 1 player at this point. Sajed looked pretty good in his DarkZero, his Maryville debut here, at least in tier 2. I'm very interested to see how he ends up filling the shoes of Scary Jerry. I don't think they're similar players in terms of their playstyle, and so I'm interested to see what exactly they want to do with him, at least here for this first series. He was more of a weak side bot laner. We'll see if that continues. I actually expect it to. I think this is going to be a lot more of how DarkZero wants to play moving forward. Spyrex was solid, if not a little bit too far forward. Credit to Adam. Man, he was trying. He was trading over and over again, oftentimes in a negative sense for Pulse, but at the very least, he wasn't afraid of Spyrex, and that's certainly something you want to see. Zyko was really good in this series. Overall, DarkZero was awesome, but how do you not point to Zamudo as the main character of this series? This is likely the best series we will talk about today from an individual player. And then for Pulse on the other side, they are just completely outclassed. As much as I'd like to praise them for staying close a little bit in game number 1, for making it at least a little bit bit relevant. It never felt like they were ever going to be able to close out that game, especially when Zamudo ended up popping off. Dr. Calculus, unfortunately, is going to get my dud of the series here. I was really excited about him coming into this split. He was the player on Pulse that I was probably the most excited about and the most looking forward to. Not a good debut. He just got completely run over by Zamudo in both games, really. Like, the Mbessa couldn't really do anything in game one, but this was one of the weaker Jace games that I've ever seen. The Scion was able to completely nullify the laning phase early on and just completely take over in the late game. This was not a good series from Dr. Calculus. We need to see better out of him. Adam, in most cases, would probably be getting done of the series, but at least he was trying, man. Oftentimes, this guy was jumping in on Tristana, taking a bunch of damage, jumping out, and still dying. It was pretty crazy to watch. Like, this guy was absolutely out of his mind, but I guess when you're a team like Pulse that's probably going to be behind in a lot of these games, I would rather see a player try to make some interesting plays rather than just completely throw the game away. Bio was pretty okay here. I'm certainly not blaming him, but Hub and Tubbs were definitely a bit outclassed. We kind of expected that. We weren't expecting the spot lane to look incredible. They did really well in the OQs, but I think going up to a higher level of competition really concerns me for these two, and they were not able to generate really any leads or any success. Hub in particular, I think, did not look good in this series, but overall, Pulse got obliterated by DarkZero. This is what we expected. This is not a learning experience for Pulse. We're going to have to see what happens to them moving forward when they start playing teams that are actually closer to their skill level, because this was just never a game, mechanically speaking, that they were going to be able to win. And then for DarkZero, it's kind of the same thing. Like, it's all well and cool to see Zamudo absolutely popping off, but there's basically like a whole tier of, you know, gameplay difference. Like, this is a tier 2 team versus a tier 3 team. This is like a tier 1.5 team, quite frankly, in DarkZero versus a tier 3 team, and it's just not supposed to be close. So of course it wasn't close. Like, Zamudo, Yuji, you know, Zyko, they all really popped off, but we need to see what this team does against actual good competition, and that, unfortunately, we're gonna have to wait another week for. But then moving on to our second series of day number 2 as we head into what is the second half of the week, technically here. It was Supernova taking on CCG Esports. Of course, Supernova, kind of Ole Miss, you know, kind of Supernova. They're kind of merged together here for the NACL. CCG, a team that I was more excited about than maybe others were in the primer, and CCG is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 win. This was a bit of an upset to some people. I was not surprised by this outcome at all. As you can see in the rankings, I had CCG 5, I had Supernova 7. I just didn't really think that, you know, Supernova was going to be on the same tier as, you know, CCG and Otter and Conviction. I had them as a tier down along with Winthrop because I think that they are closer to being Winthrop than they are to being CCG, and that kind of was the case in this series because they were just a little bit outclassed. We'll talk about their shortcomings and where I think they can improve moving forward because I do think some of their problems are pretty easily fixable, but CCG is a really good team with a lot of really interesting players. I really like the mix of high floor experienced players at this level, you know, players like Dardoch and Breezy and Array that have had a ton of time playing in tier 2 and have been in multiple different organizations, have gotten the chance to grow and learn with different groups and different players and different teams and, you know, different environments, all of that stuff. And then introducing players like Crimson, who obviously was on this team last year, but really putting him in a situation where he can actually try and win in the NACL now. And then Aljun in the mid lane, who is a really intriguing prospect that this organization clearly really likes. I think all of that coming together could make for a really intriguing roster, a potential top 4 kind of roster if everything were to click. And right now it looked really good in series number 1. Player of the series for me is pretty obviously going to go to Breezy. Despite all of the kills going to him in game number 2 on the Recon, he was the playmaker throughout both of these games. He was the creator for this entire team. And you know me, like any opportunity I can take to give a support player of the series, I probably will. Breezy has been an upper tier, like a slightly above average support at this level for a very long time. And I think that that sometimes can cloud some people's reputation of him, where it's like, he's a good, not great player, you know, all of these things that, you know, all these superlatives that people like to throw out about players that don't dominate at a level once they're there for a really long time. But Breezy has been an above average support at the tier 2 level for a long time. And if you want to sit here and tell me that he's the 3rd best support or the 4th best support right now in the NACL, yeah, I kind of believe that. Like, it's really hard to not believe that. He completely gapped Rhino in terms of the creation in this series, obviously on things like the Recon that he's always been good at, but the Rel in game number 1 was also really spectacular. He just was the one that was moving around the map and creating everything. The vision control for CCG in this series was absolutely outstanding. One of the best that we saw all week from any team in this league. It was just really cool to see Breezy have kind of a pop-off series, and I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to keep it up. Again, a reason that some people were lower on CCG is the lack of quote-unquote star talent on this team, but when you have so many good players, it's hard to complain that you don't have a star. And you know what? You might have a star. Look at Crimson on the top side, completely dominating. People are going to undervalue how good that Renekton was in game number 1 because it didn't happen in game number 2. And, you know, I get that there is a game 2 bias more naturally in a 2-game series, but that Renekton game was spectacular in game 1. And it's not like the Olaf was much worse in game 2. Dardoch was excellent on the Mundo in game number 2 as well. People are not expecting Mundo jungle at this level, and it's not just, oh, we throw a Mundo jungle in there and allow Dardoch to do what he wants. Like, they played around this thing really well. I thought Aljun was a really good team fighter here, really good positioning. Did a good job of actually baiting a lot of resources into him before he got to safety. Nice stuff overall from him on the Hui. Array was also really good at being able to follow up on a lot of the plays that Breezy was creating, but again, this was more of a team effort than anything else. As much as I want to sit here and say Breezy was dominant, or Crimson looked incredible, or Dardoch's Mundo really stood out, you know, Aljun and Array were also really good. Like, it's all 5 members of this team, and I think that's really encouraging. People thought that Supernova was at the very least on the same level as CCG. I don't think that that's the case. I think they proved here that they are clearly the better of these 2 teams, and for Supernova, as much as I'd like to sit here and say that, oh, they're, you know, not as good as we thought, like, they're clearly a bottom 4 team, because in my primer video, I did say the bottom 4 felt pretty locked for me. I just don't know if that's the takeaway I have from this. I think they were pretty inflexible in terms of how they played throughout these games, where they clearly had a strategy, they clearly had an idea of what they wanted to do going into this series. You can see it in both drafts. They have Jax, Sejuani, Corki in game number 1, even the Syndra, right? And then you've got the Azir, the Zeri, you know, the Cassante for game number 2. Like, you are not trying to win lane early. You are trying to play for team fights. That's clearly where you feel like you're going to have the most amount of an advantage. But the problem is not everybody on the team was going to be able to get to that spot if you're basically sacrificing everything in the early game, and I think they kind of ran into that problem. Dud of the series, I should say, for me, is going to go to Rhino in the support position. I like Rhino. I really like Shogo and Rhino as a duo, but Breezy was way better as a support in this series, and it's really not even all that close. Rhino was just not particularly relevant throughout either of these games. Breezy was everywhere on the map, constantly setting up vision, constantly laying traps for Supernova, and Rhino was pretty consistently falling into those traps, and I think this is just one of those, like, welcome to the NACL type of games for him. Again, hopefully he's going to be able to, you know, turn things around, but this was not a great debut. I think Keel was really bad in this series, and part of that is the draft. Like, I just don't think you can justify having Zyra in game number 2. I get that he's a big Zyra player, but first of all, Zyra and Namundo, that a really good draft pick there for CCG. And also Zyra plus Azir plus Zeri. I just don't get it, man. Like, I don't really personally understand the draft philosophy, and I think they did really struggle because of it. Stray, I think, was not as good as Crimson on the other side of this, although I'm not blaming Stray. At times, he was the best player on this team. Asyla also trying his best. Shogo wasn't really able to do much on Corki and Zeri once the game kind of got out of control. Overall, it just felt like Supernova was pretty consistently on the back foot here, and a lot of that was the creation from CCG, them being able to control the map, and quite frankly, them just having more pressure and priority throughout this game, or throughout this series, both of these games, really, and that's really what separated them. Supernova's going to need to step up later on in the week, but this is a really nice start to the season for CCG, and I do think this team is better than people are giving them credit for. There is a lot of talent on this team, and I think the floor for them is really high. That's why they came in top 5 for me in my power rankings, and I'm glad to see that kind of paid off here. But then moving on to our 5th series and the start of the 3rd and final day of week number 1, and it was a matchup between Winthrop University and Blue Otter that we get our first upset of the entire split in, with Winthrop picking up the 2-0 victory, not dropping a single game to Blue Otter here. Don't get it twisted, this is definitely an upset. I think that there are some people that would like to make it out to say that Winthrop is better than people are, expecting. I was not, on that train going into this split. I had them pretty clearly at number 8. Supernova was in that tier with them at number 7 for me in that primer, but it was really not close. I thought Supernova would be better than Winthrop, and I certainly thought Blue Otter would be better than Winthrop. They were at the top of the tier above, even if I don't think there was a gigantic gap between those two tiers, and for them to go down really without a ton of fight, in my opinion here, throughout both of these games, it's kind of disappointing. It's certainly a disappointing result overall for Blue Otter, but we have to remember this team ramped up a lot over the course of last year. There's really no reason to believe that they're not just going to continue to get better as they continue to go along, but huge win for Winthrop, and really kind of a defining win for Winthrop, at least in my opinion, because player of the series is going to go to Mobility in the bot lane, and we talked about this a lot going into the year, but if Winthrop was going to be able to overperform what my and a lot of other people's expectations for this team were, was through the bot lane. They were always going to have to win through the bot lane, in my opinion, and That's kind of what they did in this series, and obviously the rest of the team was really good. I want to point out jungle mid, and we will get to jungle mid because I think that they were incredible here, definitely better than their opposition on the other side, but Mobility is the main character of Winthrop. He was 3 levels up on the Misfortune in game number 2. He was really strong on the Ashe in game number 1. This is a very clear player of the series for me. I don't really think it's all that up for debate. Mobility has the potential to be a superstar at this level in the same way that we talked about with a player like Shogo, even with someone like Levitate on the other side. Levitate kind of broke out throughout the end of last year, but he was not as good as Mobility in this matchup. Now, part of that is that Rovex didn't play particularly well in this series, and part of that is that, Mobility and only 35 did get a lot of resources, and, we're up a lot of XP and a lot of gold by the time that Levitate could try and team fight towards the back half of this game, but to get there in the first place is still a big credit to players like Mobility and only 35, who I think did play really well here. If this team is going to continue to overperform expectations, I would expect that this bot lane is going to continue to be successful, or need to be successful in that regard. But jungle mid still was really good for Winthrop. I think underratedly good. Wilson was awesome, especially in game 2 on the Xin Zhao. Thought he completely out-jungled Music. Even if Music was generally fine on the other side for Blue Water, I would definitely say Music was the one trying to do the most for that team, but Wilson was really, really good here, and obviously this is a player who's kind of been near the top of tier 3 for quite a long time, under multiple names, under, Trickster, under Wakao. Like, he's played under a bunch of different names, but you've probably seen him play at some point if you've watched any of tier 3 because he's been so successful there for quite a long time. For him to finally get a shot here in tier 2 and for it to go so well in his first game, I think is really, really cool. Hopefully that continues. Sword, obviously another player that a lot of people are going to remember because he's been on multiple actual LCS affiliated organizations before, both as a mid laner and as a support. He played really well in this series. Samikin was not great in game number 2. We'll talk about that a bit more when we go over to the Otter side. Sword was definitely the better of these two mid laners, and that's not really what we expected going into this series. Denethor even goes deathless on the top side. It's not like he's like the weak link of this team or anything. He was definitely the better top laner out of these two teams, and so you just feel really good about Winthrop where they're sitting after this first series. The only concern is that you just gotta hope that they can continue it and that this isn't more on Blue Otter kind of not playing well than it is on Winthrop actually playing well, because this felt like a Winthrop-oriented series in terms of them being able to take over a lot of these games. Credit to Mobility, credit to Wilson, credit to Sword, credit to Only 35, credit to Denethor, credit to all 5 of these guys, because they all played really well, and hopefully they can keep it up. And then for Blue Otter on the other side, it just was not what you were expecting. This is not the start to the season that I think that they wanted to have. I mean, obviously, like, you could probably have predicted that, but really, I mean, this is not a good result for them in a lot of different ways, not only because you lose 0-2, but because I think there were some pretty glaring weaknesses in terms of your gameplay here. There were 2 players that I really considered for dead of the series. Those, of course, being Rovex and Samikin. I think that they were pretty clearly the 2 weak links on Blue Otter. Quacker was definitely in the conversation for me. It's not even like Levitate played all that well, but I ended up settling on Rovex being my dead of the series here. He had no pressure, no priority. These were 2 of the worst games I've seen Rovex play at this level in a long time. I mean, going back, like, this felt a lot more similar to 2023 Rovex than it did to 2024 Rovex, and that's an unfortunate thing to say. Again, if the bot lane 2v2 is not going to go Blue Otter's way, that was a big reason why they started to emerge at the end of last year, is that Levitate was really dominating the 2v2s, and Rovex was really helping out with that. He was a great facilitator, a great setup man, and a great mid-game player. If they're not able to get to the mid-game at even like a remotely neutral stage, that is a gigantic issue for Blue Water, and obviously that wasn't the case here. Samikin also is kind of going to go undervalued for how not good he was in this series. I think he definitely needs to play better than this. He blows his flash early on Lux, and that gets punished over and over and over again by Winthrop. It just was not a great situation. Lux is not a pick that I think is particularly relevant right now in the game. I just don't think she does enough to justify it. I get it in Fearless, like, he's probably very comfortable on the champ, but I didn't feel great about Samikin in these games. Like, Quacker wasn't as good as Denethor on the other side of this. You can see that in the scoreline. Again, Levitate needs to be better. He is the star of this team, at least from my perspective. He is the star of this team, and he just was not good enough in the 2v2. Music was, I guess, generally fine. He was at least attempting to make plays, but often was just out-jungled by Wilson, because Wilson had so much more priority and pressure across the map with his team being in the lead throughout basically every single lane, and that's just not a good spot for Blue Otter. When they were losing games last year, they were losing it through not being able to generate enough pressure early, and that kind of does seem like it's going to be the case right now. And then for Winthrop, like, this is a fantastic win. Again, the biggest thing that could have happened for them at the start of this split, if they can keep this kind of pressure up, and if Mobility actually is kind of a star down in the bot lane, which I'm certainly not ruling out, who's to say this can't be a top 4 team in the NACL? But that's going to go ahead and bring us to our final series of the week here, and it's another really good one, at least in terms of power rankings. It was Conviction taking on Supernova And Conviction is going to pick up the 2-0 win. So many 2-0s this week. Not a lot of series going all 3 games. In fact, only one going all 3 games. But you can't really complain when Conviction looks as good as they do in these games. 4-0 in their first week. This team looks absolutely dominant. And I think the players that you needed to see step up, the players that you really wanted to see kind of, show that they belong at the NACL level, not only belong, but can compete near the top at the NACL level, they did exactly that. The stars of this series are absolutely Hoarder and Manui, and that's absolutely what you would have wanted to see if you were a Conviction fan. And then for Supernova on the other side, it's a pretty bad week number 1 for them. Not only did they go 0-4, did they not pick up a game win, but they did look kind of lost out there. It didn't really feel like they were all that competitive, and I think especially with the expectation that, players like Shogo or players like Keel would have such a high floor coming into this, tier 2, coming into the NACL, for them to perform so poorly against, yes, teams that are better than them, but teams that they should at least be able to compete with is not a particularly good look, which I'll talk about later on. But starting with Conviction, player of the series, come on, man, it's got to go to Hoarder again. Talk about an absolute star-making week number 1 from a brand new top laner in tier 2. Hoarder looked like an absolute monster across all 4 games that he played so far this week, and from what we know of him, this is not the end of the Hoarder story. It's not like, he kind of showcased a lot of his weird picks, and, teams weren't exactly prepared, but now that they have seen some tape, they're going to be able to react. We've seen that before in tier 2. Hell, we've seen that in tier 1 for multiple different regions where a player starts off hot and can't keep that momentum up because teams figure him out. The thing about Hoarder is he's not even revealed like the full bag of tricks yet. He's winning with the normal stuff, and he's already really good at a lot of the off-meta stuff. And so I'm very, very excited for what Hoarder is going to look like down the stretch of this year. We were talking about him needing to be one of the upper tier top laners if Conviction wanted to kind of slowly break into that upper echelon, if they wanted to be number 4 or so in the power rankings. Well, that's exactly what's happening. He's not just breaking through and kind of proving that he's one of the more interesting like upper tier top laners here, but he could be a top 3 top laner right now in terms of the performances that he gave over week number 1. He decimated everybody that he went into. Obviously, the Olaf game in their first series that they played earlier on this week, but both games here, the Ambessa and the Jax, the guy had like a 31 or whatever KDA, something ridiculous. It's actually unfair how good he was in both of the series that they played, and Stray was not able to keep up. Some of this was Stray underperforming and making some, positioning mistakes, which we'll talk about on the Gangplank in particular, but Hoarder is so good at being able to dominate lane. I feel like this guy is a potential superstar in the making. It's just 1 week, but it's about as good of a 1 week as you could possibly have. And then Manui is the other player that I really want to shout out. Maybe I undersold how good he was in the first series. Maybe I didn't talk it up enough, but man, if you wanted to see like a real big playmaking, like star performance from Manui, watch the Rel game here in game number 2. I honestly considered giving him player of the series just because of how good he was as a primary engage option. He is clearly the one calling the shots as the primary shot caller on this team. And he's the one pressing the go button on Rel, and boy, does that work out. I think it's kind of clear now, at least to me, why this team looked so much better in the OQs when he was playing Engagers rather versus when he was playing Enchanters. And, it's not because I think Manui is way worse at Enchanters or anything, but I think because when he is on Engagers, him being kind of the go button, him being the player that is going to be making the decision on when and where to start fights is just so easy for the rest of this team to be able to gather around and follow up on. And I think it's a really good winning strategy. Chrome looked awesome in week number 1. Like, he was better, I would say, in the first series, but it's not like he was bad here in the second series. Dude went 13-2-21. Darkwings and Kisno continue to look really good. Kisno was maybe a little bit over eager at times here, getting caught out a little bit more than maybe he needed to, but still, like, how can you really criticize anything that happened with Conviction, especially after that game number 2? Hoarder looks like a monster. Manui gets better game after game. Chrome can still be one of the best AD carries in the entire league, and if Kisno and Darkwings are the players you're like, oh, they didn't pop off in week number 1, I think you're in a pretty good spot moving forward for Conviction. This might be a top 4 team right now. And then for Supernova on the other side, like I said, it's kind of a disaster starting week for them. 0-4 is really not the way you wanted to start off the NACL, but there is still a lot of time to be able to recoup and recover. Unfortunately, dead of the series, you had plenty of options here. Right? You had Keel as an option, you had Rhino once again as an option, but I'm going to give it to Stray in the top lane, not only because Hoarder was able to, beat him up in the 1v1 because Hoarder was really good here, but I think Stray made a lot of mistakes individually on his own as well. I don't think this was just Hoarder, winning these exchanges and him being really good. I think Stray kind of made it a little bit easier for him to be able to win, especially on that Gangplank, man. His positioning was just not great. You need to see more out of Stray. Again, another player that had some question marks coming into the NACL. Those have not been answered just yet. Keel has been a huge letdown so far throughout the first week. This is a guy who's been contending for MVP at this level before, and he was pretty awful in week number 1. Just was not good enough in either of the series that they played. Rhino also looks pretty out outclassed at this level. Both of the supports that he went into this week were just better players than him. Both Manui and Breezy felt like they were like a full tier above him in terms of the creation opportunities. Now, part of that is the rest of the team just not having prio, but part of that is Rhino just not being good in these games. Asyla doesn't look like he's going to be a top tier mid laner, but that was kind of projected by me. And, you know, as much as I like Shogo, it's not like he's able to 1v9 or like take over these games. He was basically funneled on the Draven in game 2, and they had no pressure on that side of the map. It's just not looking good right now for Supernova. They're going to drop in my power rankings, and honestly, I am a bit concerned about this team. It's only 2 best of 3s. It's only 1 week. You don't want to jump to conclusions or say this is going to be a bottom 2 team or anything like that, but it really was about as bad as it could get for me, at least in week number 1. And then for Conviction on the other side, it's the opposite story. It's about as good as it could possibly get in week number 1. Maybe you wanted to see some better performances out of Kisno and Darkwings, but like seriously, at that point, you are just like grasping for straws. You are trying to find a reason to be upset about what Conviction did. The 4-0 this week was dominant. Top and bot lane were unstoppable throughout both of those series, specifically Hoarder on the top side. It's not like Chrome and Manui didn't look great. Conviction looks like one of the scarier teams right now in the NACL, and they might live up to that, you know, OQ billing where they took down some of the scarier teams there as well. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 1 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 1 week of action. So many ties, so many different 1-0 or 0-1 teams, of course. All of these ties are just broken alphabetically. I'm not trying to show any favoritism here. That's what the power rankings are for, and you can see that to the right of every single team. You'll see a couple of things there. Power rank is where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10. Change is going to be how that has changed from the preseason to now, before week 1 to after week 1, and the streak, of course, is just the streak that they are on in terms of their series. So we can go over the risers and the fallers. The big riser, of course, this week is going to be Conviction, going from number 6 to number 4 in my power rankings. This just feels like the bare minimum I can do for them right now. It does feel like they're clicking on basically every single cylinder. As much as I like CCG, Conviction proved more to me in week number 1, and so they are going to get the jump on that number 4 spot, especially with Blue Otter really struggling, and they're actually going to be my biggest fallers of the week, going from number 4 to number 6. Some people might drop them even further than that. They are still 1 spot above Winthrop, who they lost to. That might not make a lot of sense to people, but I think when projecting out to the future, I still expect Blue Otter to be better than Winthrop, at least for now. Like, if you go forward to playoffs, like, if these 2 teams were to play again, do I think Otter would still lose that one? I don't think I would necessarily bet them to lose that, although I don't think it's all that far off from being the reality right now. Winthrop is going to move up to number 7, jumping Supernova, who drops to number 8. I still feel like the bottom 2 are the bottom till until proven otherwise, I should say. And then the top 3 are not changing at all. DarkZero looked unbelievable in their matchup against Pulse, and Luminosity was able to get the better of Near Airport, therefore they stay above them in the power rankings, but they still are the top 3 teams pretty clearly in the NACL. So let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below when it comes to the standings, but it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week. And lucky for us, I think this is a pretty easy conversation to have for week number 1, because there were a couple of players that were great, player that maybe wasn't so good, or a team in general that wasn't so good, but player of the week was super easy. There's no way you can give this to anyone other than Hoarder, the top laner for Conviction. He was exceptionally good in all 4 games that he played across this week. There really are no negatives that I can give him. Shout out to Hoarder for doing a face reveal basically as I'm editing this video so that I can get a player picture in for him, but he was unbelievable. And if he's going to continue to play like this throughout the split, Conviction might even be better than number 4 in the rankings. One of the big things that we talked about is that top lane kind of is up for grabs right now. The top 2 top laners are all really good, and TF Blade's supposed to be in that conversation, but anybody can be the 3rd best top laner in the NACL right now. And right now, Hoarder is definitely leading the pack in terms of that conversation, but he's not at the top because, you know, my runner-up, my honorable mentions, Zamudo, obviously going to get that. If he had played more than 1 series this week, he probably would have been player of the week. He had the most individually dominant series that anybody played. He absolutely decimated Pulse in their matchup against each other, and obviously that, you know, plays into it a little bit, but Hoarder had 2 really good series instead of Zamudo's 1, and so he gets the nod here. But Mobility also going to be an honorable mention. If you wanted to give this to Breezy, the support for CCG, I think that's also fine, but Hoarder is going to get my player of the week, Zamudo and Mobility my runner-ups. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, was also pretty obvious. It's going to go to Rhino, the support for Supernova. Supernova in general just did not have a good week number 1. They really were not successful at basically anything. They went 0-4. They didn't look particularly good, and part of that was Rhino just not being good enough in both of their matchups. Manui was better than him, and Breezy was better than him in both of their matchups, and it's definitely not a great place for him to be, but I do think that there is a lot of reason to expect a turnaround. Again, Shogo and Rhino were so good as a 2v2 in Tier 3. You have to imagine that with a little bit more time, maybe against, you know, some better, or I guess less strong teams, maybe they'll be able to kind of turn it around, get their confidence back, but at least for now, Rhino's going to get my dud of the week for week number 1, and Hoarder will get my player of the week for week number 1. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be posting about the NACL all split long on this channel, but we cover all 4 of the major regions as well: LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all